The engine purred, a low, contented rumble against the crisp morning air. My old pickup, a trusty companion through countless deployments and even more mundane errands, idled patiently as I considered my options. My driveway, usually a clear path to the world beyond the base gates, was currently a jumbled obstacle course of renovation debris. Bags of concrete mix, stacks of lumber, and a surprisingly heavy old sink sat waiting for their turn to be hauled away. My plan for the weekend, a rare and cherished 2 days off, was simple: tackle the long overdue garage clean out and perhaps, just perhaps, enjoy a quiet beer on the porch. Little did I know, the universe, or more specifically, my new neighbor, had other plans. I decided the easiest temporary solution was to park the truck across the end of my driveway, just inside my property line, while I wrestled with a particularly stubborn pile of old tires. It was a 5-minute job, max. I figured no one would even notice. I wrestled with the tires, grunting as the rubber resisted my efforts. Sweat beaded on my forehead despite the cool morning. Just as I finally pried the last tire free, a shrill voice cut through the peaceful hum of the neighborhood. "What do you think you're doing?" I turned to see a woman storming across her perfectly manicured lawn, a tiny poodle yapping indignantly at her heels. Her face was a mask of indignant fury, her perfectly coiffed blonde hair bouncing with each angry stride. I recognized her as Mrs. Henderson, a recent transplant to our quiet street, and someone who had, in the brief 2 months she'd lived here, managed to establish herself as the unofficial arbiter of all things neighborhood-related. I hadn't interacted with her much, preferring to keep to myself after long weeks at the base, but I'd heard stories from other neighbors about her enthusiastic enforcement of imagined rules. "Morning, Mrs. Henderson," I replied, trying to keep my tone even. "Just clearing out some junk. I'll be moved in a minute." She scoffed, planting her hands on her hips. "A minute? You're blocking the entire street. This is a residential area, not your personal junkyard. My daughter could need to get through here at any moment. What if there's an emergency? What if someone needs to get to the hospital?" She was escalating rapidly, her voice growing louder with each accusation. I looked around. The street was empty. The sun was barely up. My truck was clearly within my property line, and there was ample room for any vehicle, emergency or otherwise, to pass. But trying to reason with Mrs. Henderson, I was quickly learning, was like trying to explain quantum physics to a brick. "Mrs. Henderson, I assure you, there's plenty of room," I began, gesturing to the wide expanse of asphalt. "And I'm on my own property." Her eyes narrowed. "On your property? That's rich. You think you can just park your dilapidated vehicle wherever you please? This is a respectable neighborhood. I pay good taxes for these streets, to be clear, not to be obstructed by whatever this mess is." She gestured wildly at my modest but well-maintained pickup and the scattered renovation materials. The poodle, sensing its owner's agitation, began to bark with renewed vigor, a tiny, shrill accompaniment to her tirade. I felt a familiar weariness creep over me. Dealing with petty civilian squabbles was the last thing I wanted on my precious weekend. But Mrs. Henderson wasn't finished. Not by a long shot. I took a deep breath, counting to 10 in my head, a trick I'd learned long ago in high-stress situations. It was remarkable how quickly a quiet Saturday morning could devolve into a full-blown neighborhood drama, all thanks to a misplaced sense of entitlement and a seemingly boundless capacity for indignation. Mrs. Henderson was now pulling out her phone, her fingers flying across the screen. "This is simply unacceptable," she muttered, not to me, but to an unseen recipient on the other end of the line. "I'm calling the police. They'll know how to deal with your blatant disregard for community standards." My eyebrows shot up. The police? For parking my truck on my own property for a few minutes? This was truly next level. A small part of me wanted to laugh at the sheer absurdity of the situation, but the larger part, the part that dealt with real crises on a daily basis, was already preparing for the inevitable paperwork and explanations. "Mrs. Henderson, there's really no need to involve the police," I said, trying one last time to de-escalate. "I'm literally moving it right now. I just needed to clear these tires." I gestured to the nearly empty space where the offending tires had been. She ignored me, her voice now a rapid-fire succession of complaints into her phone. "Yes, an obstructed driveway, a large, unsightly vehicle, a clear violation of public access, an immediate response is required." I watched, incredulous, as she provided my address with a flourish, as if she were reporting a major felony in progress. The poodle, having tired of barking, now sniffed inquisitively at a discarded piece of drywall. True to her word, it wasn't long before the distinct wail of a siren pierced the morning air. 2 patrol cars pulled up, lights flashing, their presence a stark contrast to the quiet residential street. 2 officers emerged, their faces a mixture of professional stoicism and, I suspected, mild annoyance at being dispatched to what was clearly a non-emergency. I recognized Officer Miller, a younger man who had just joined the force, and Officer Rodriguez, a veteran I'd seen around town. They approached cautiously, their eyes scanning the scene, the parked truck, the renovation debris, and Mrs. Henderson, who was now practically vibrating with self-importance. "Good morning, ma'am, sir," Officer Rodriguez began, his voice calm and even. "We received a call about a blocked driveway." He looked from Mrs. Henderson to me, then to my truck, which was still clearly within my property boundaries. "It's completely blocked," Mrs. Henderson shrieked, pointing dramatically at my truck. "He thinks he can just do whatever he wants. This is an outrage. I demand you ticket him and have that monstrosity towed immediately." Officer Miller, looking a little bewildered, glanced at his senior partner. Officer Rodriguez, however, had seen it all before. He walked slowly around my truck, assessing the situation. He noted the clear space on the road, the lack of any actual obstruction, and then, his eyes landed on my uniform shirt, which I had simply thrown on that morning, still emblazoned with the insignia of my rank. His gaze lingered for a moment, a flicker of recognition in his eyes, before he turned back to Mrs. Henderson with a polite, but firm, expression. This was going to be interesting. Officer Rodriguez, a seasoned professional, had a way of maintaining a poker face, but I could tell by the subtle tightening of his jaw and the almost imperceptible widening of his eyes that he had made the connection. My uniform shirt, a simple navy blue polo with the embroidered emblem of the base command, was usually reserved for casual Fridays or quick runs to the commissary. Today, it was serving a far more impactful purpose. Mrs. Henderson, however, was too caught up in her righteous indignation to notice the shift in the officer's demeanor. She continued her tirade, oblivious to the fact that her carefully constructed narrative was about to crumble. "And he was so rude," she exclaimed, her voice reaching another crescendo. "He just stood there, smirking, as if he owned the place. This is a clear violation of city ordinances. He needs to be taught a lesson." She gestured wildly at me, then at the truck, then back at me, as if trying to physically embody the injustice she felt. Officer Miller, still new to the job, looked increasingly uncomfortable, his eyes darting between Mrs. Henderson and me, then to his partner, silently seeking guidance. Officer Rodriguez finally held up a hand, a gentle but unmistakable signal for Mrs. Henderson to pause. "Ma'am, we understand your concerns, but we need to assess the situation calmly." He then turned to me, his gaze direct. "Sir, could you please clarify your name and what you're doing here?" He knew my name, of course, or at least he knew of me. But protocol was protocol, especially when a civilian was making such a public spectacle. "Yes, officer," I replied, my voice calm, a stark contrast to Mrs. Henderson's histrionics. "My name is Commander David Miller. I live here." I was just moving some renovation debris and temporarily parked my truck across the end of my driveway, on my own property, for about 5 minutes. As you can see, the street is completely clear, and I've already moved the items. I gestured to the now almost empty spot where the tires had been. I watched Mrs. Henderson's face as the words Commander David Miller registered. First, a flicker of confusion, then a dawning realization, and finally, a slow, agonizing slide into utter mortification. The color drained from her face, leaving her with a rather pasty pallor. The furious glint in her eyes was replaced by a wide-eyed, almost comical, look of disbelief. Officer Rodriguez nodded, his expression unreadable. "Thank you, Commander Miller. It seems there's been a misunderstanding, ma'am," he said, turning back to Mrs. Henderson, his tone now subtly different, less accommodating. "Commander Miller is well within his rights to park on his own property. There's no obstruction of the roadway, and no violation of any city ordinance." He paused, letting the words hang in the air, allowing their full weight to settle upon Mrs. Henderson. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. The tiny poodle, sensing the sudden shift in atmosphere, whimpered softly. The tables had not just turned, they had been completely upended, leaving Mrs. Henderson sputtering and speechless in their wake. It was a moment of quiet, satisfying vindication, not because I enjoyed her discomfort, but because it brought a swift end to an utterly ridiculous situation. The silence that followed Officer Rodriguez's declaration was profound, broken only by the distant chirping of birds and the faint hum of my idling pickup truck. Mrs. Henderson, who moments ago had been a whirlwind of righteous fury, now stood frozen, her mouth slightly agape, her eyes fixed on my uniform shirt as if it had suddenly transformed into a venomous snake. The realization that she had just called the police on the base commander, her neighbor, for a non-existent infraction, had clearly hit her like a ton of bricks. The usually unflappable woman looked utterly deflated, her carefully constructed persona of neighborhood authority crumbling around her. Officer Miller, who had been a silent observer through much of this, now looked at me with a newfound respect, a slight smile playing on his lips. He'd clearly put two and two together and was probably contemplating the story he'd tell back at the precinct. Officer Rodriguez, ever the professional, allowed the awkward silence to linger for a moment longer before speaking again, his voice firm but not unkind. "Ma'am, as I said, there's no actionable offense here. Commander Miller is simply cleaning his property. We'll be heading out." Mrs. Henderson finally managed to stammer, but I thought, the truck." Her voice trailed off, a pathetic whisper compared to her earlier shouts. She avoided my gaze, her eyes darting nervously. The bravado, the indignation, the sheer entitlement, it had all evaporated, replaced by a palpable sense of embarrassment. It was almost pitiable, but a part of me couldn't help but feel that a dose of humility was long overdue for our self-appointed neighborhood watchdog. "No buts, ma'am," Officer Rodriguez interjected gently. "The situation has been assessed. There's nothing for us to do." He then turned to me, a more relaxed expression on his face. "Commander Miller, my apologies for the disruption to your morning. Is there anything else we can assist with?" "No, officer, thank you," I replied, a small smile finally breaking through. "I appreciate you coming out and clarifying things." I exchanged a knowing glance with Officer Rodriguez, a silent acknowledgement of the absurdity of the situation and the unspoken camaraderie of dealing with the public. As the officers turned to head back to their patrol cars, Mrs. Henderson finally managed to find her voice, albeit a much quieter, less aggressive one. I'm sorry," she mumbled, not quite looking at me. I didn't realize." I simply nodded, acknowledging her apology without rubbing it in. As the police cars pulled away, their sirens now silent, a newfound quiet settled over the street. Mrs. Henderson, her head bowed, quickly retreated back into her perfectly manicured lawn, the tiny poodle scampering after her. I watched her go, then turned back to my truck, a strange mix of amusement and relief washing over me. My quiet weekend had certainly taken an unexpected turn, but it had also, perhaps, established a new understanding in the neighborhood. The saga of Karen called police when I blocked my own drive had come to a rather anticlimactic, yet deeply satisfying, conclusion. I finished moving the last of the debris, the sun now high in the sky, ready to finally enjoy that quiet beer on the porch. The neighborhood, I suspected, would be a little more peaceful from now on. The rest of my weekend passed with a welcome return to tranquility. The renovation debris was cleared, the garage was organized, and I did, finally, enjoy that quiet beer on the porch. But the events of Saturday morning had clearly sent ripples through the usually sedate waters of our neighborhood. I noticed a distinct change in the atmosphere. Cars passing by slowed down just a touch more than usual, and neighbors who usually offered a quick nod now stopped for genuinely friendly, if somewhat curious, conversations. It was clear that the dramatic visit from the police, orchestrated by Mrs. Henderson, had become the new neighborhood hot topic. And more importantly, my actual identity, BaseCommander David Miller, not just the quiet guy who lives next to the busybody, was now public knowledge. On Sunday afternoon, as I was hosing down my patio, Mr. Johnson from across the street ambled over, holding 2 cold sodas. Mr. Johnson was a sweet, elderly gentleman who had always treated me kindly but was generally quite reserved. "Commander Miller," he said, handing me a soda, "I just wanted to say, thank you." I raised an eyebrow, genuinely confused. "Thank me for what, Mr. Johnson?" He chuckled, a dry, rattling sound. "For putting Mrs. Henderson in her place, son. That woman has been a menace since she moved in. She tried to report my grandkids for excessive ball bouncing last summer. We were all just waiting for someone to deliver a little dose of reality. Didn't realize it would come in the form of the BaseCommander." His words confirmed my suspicion. The entire street had been holding its collective breath, hoping someone would stand up to Mrs. Henderson's petty authoritarianism. My accidental confrontation, and the ensuing revelation of my rank right in front of the police she called, had inadvertently made me the neighborhood hero. It was a bizarre development, but a strangely heartwarming one. People started treating me differently, not with fear, but with a kind of relieved respect. My military role, which I usually kept separate from my home life, had unexpectedly become a tool for neighborhood peace. The most notable change, however, was Mrs. Henderson herself. I saw her a couple of times over the next few days. She was always perfectly dressed and accompanied by her poodle, but she moved with a new sense of caution. She meticulously avoided making eye contact. If she saw me outside, she would abruptly cross the street or retreat into her house. The loud, demanding woman who had stormed across my lawn was gone, replaced by a strangely subdued figure. The embarrassment of her public miscalculation calling the police on a high-ranking military officer for a non-existent parking violation on his own property had clearly achieved what weeks of gentle reasoning could not: silence and retreat. The street, once under the subtle dictatorship of her imagined rules, felt lighter, freer. The incident, while initially irritating, had served as a necessary catalyst, establishing a clear boundary and a new, more respectful, community dynamic where common sense, and the law, prevailed over baseless indignation. The BaseCommander had won the quiet, unexpected battle for neighborhood sanity. The quiet respect I began receiving from the neighborhood was one thing, but the official response from Mrs. Henderson was another entirely. 3 days after the incident, a crisp, linen envelope appeared in my mailbox. It was heavy, sealed with a small, decorative sticker, and addressed to Commander David Miller. I carried it inside, a feeling of deep curiosity mixing with faint amusement. Inside, I found a beautifully printed card, the kind reserved for formal invitations, and a handwritten note. The note was short, impeccably neat, and utterly contrite. It read, "Dear Commander Miller, please accept my sincerest and deepest apologies for my unwarranted outburst and gross misjudgment regarding the temporary placement of your vehicle last Saturday. I was clearly mistaken and behaved in an inexcusable manner. I take full responsibility for wasting the time of local law enforcement and causing you undue stress. I hope you can find it in your heart to forgive my lapse in judgment. Respectfully, Helen Henderson, Mrs. R.J. Henderson. I leaned back in my chair, rereading the note. Helen. Not Karen. The carefully formal structure, the use of her husband's initial, it was a performance of humility, yes, but the apology felt surprisingly genuine. The confrontation and the subsequent revelation of my rank had completely shattered her illusion of control, forcing her to confront the reality of her behavior. It wasn't just an apology, it was a surrender. Later that week, I was taking out the trash when I saw her struggling with a large, heavy bag of gardening clippings. She hesitated when she saw me, her face coloring slightly, clearly expecting me to ignore her or, worse, offer a cutting remark. Instead, I walked over without a word, took the heavy bag from her, and tossed it into the municipal bin. "Good morning, Mrs. Henderson," I said, keeping my tone polite and neutral. "Be careful not to strain yourself." She looked genuinely shocked. "Commander Miller, thank you." I didn't think. "We're neighbors, Mrs. Henderson," I interrupted gently, deciding that extending an olive branch was far more productive than maintaining a cold feud. "We all have bad days. I appreciate your note. Consider the matter closed." I gave her a brief nod and walked back towards my house. It was a simple gesture, but the look on her face was one of profound relief and maybe, just maybe, a tiny bit of newfound respect. The incident, which began with her calling the police on me, had somehow evolved into a strange, unspoken alliance, a quiet understanding that we could coexist peacefully, provided the rules of decorum were observed. The immediate aftermath had brought quiet, but this small interaction offered the promise of genuine peace. Weeks turned into a month, and the neighborhood settled into its new normal. The Karen incident had faded from being the main topic of gossip to an amusing anecdote, usually recounted with a wink and a knowing look towards me. The true test of Mrs. Henderson's, or rather, Helen's change, however, arrived with the annual community picnic, a long-standing tradition held at the small park near the base housing entrance. Attendance by base personnel and local residents was always high, fostering a rare blend of military and civilian community life. As commander, my attendance was mandatory, though I usually kept a low profile. This year, however, I found myself drawn into conversations about the base's upcoming charity drive, lending a certain gravity to the proceedings. I was standing near the grill, discussing logistics with the head of the neighborhood association, when Helen Henderson approached. She wasn't carrying a clipboard or wearing the judgmental expression she once favored. Instead, she was holding a large, steaming casserole dish, and she looked nervous. "Commander Miller," she said, her voice soft and hesitant. "I hope you don't mind. I brought my famous green bean casserole. It's for the potluck." "That's very kind of you, Helen," I replied genuinely, accepting the dish to place it on the table. "I hear it's excellent." She managed a small, tentative smile. "It's a family recipe. Actually, I wanted to ask you something, completely unrelated to that day," she lowered her voice conspiratorially. "My nephew is graduating high school next year, and he's very interested in the Air Force Academy. He's a bright kid, top of his class, but I don't really know anyone who could offer him practical advice or maybe a letter of recommendation for his application package." She bit her lip, clearly expecting a polite brush off, or perhaps a reference to her past behavior. Instead, I considered her request. It was a serious ask, demonstrating trust and a recognition of my professional role, a far cry from reporting my parking. It was a sign that she was willing to move past the embarrassing drama and treat me as a neighbor and a resource. "I'd be happy to speak with him, Helen," I said, meeting her eyes. "Have him gather his transcripts and his essay draft, and we can set up a time next week. A good recommendation can make a difference." The look of profound gratitude and relief that washed over her face was unmistakable. "Thank you, David. Truly. That means the world to us." She had dropped the formal Commander Miller, using my first name for the first time. It was a small but significant shift, solidifying the new, respectful dynamic between us. The Karen who had called the police on me was gone. In her place was Helen, a neighbor seeking assistance for her family, a sign that the absurd incident had, ironically, forged an unlikely, peaceful bond. The quiet truce had just become an active, supportive alliance. A week later, Helen's nephew, Ethan, arrived at my house. He was everything his aunt described: bright, articulate, and clearly dedicated, dressed in a sharp blazer despite the casual setting. We spent over an hour reviewing his application materials and discussing what life at the Air Force Academy truly entails: the rigor, the opportunities, and the immense commitment required. I offered him some pointed advice on strengthening his personal essay and promised to write a strong letter of recommendation focusing on his potential for leadership and service, qualities I had gleaned from our conversation. As Ethan gathered his papers to leave, Helen walked him out. She stopped at my porch, her expression earnest. "Thank you again, David. You didn't have to do that, and it means everything." "It's my pleasure, Helen," I replied. "He's a great kid. I think he has a real shot." She paused, then a genuine smile, one I hadn't seen before, free of tension or defensiveness, crept across her face. "You know," she started, shaking her head slightly, "when I first moved here, I truly believed I was doing the right thing, trying to maintain order. I was so focused on the tiny rules, I completely missed the bigger picture, and the people." She looked down for a moment, then back up, a spark of humor in her eyes. "I think the look on Officer Rodriguez's face that morning, when he realized who I had called him on, will haunt me forever." I couldn't help but laugh, a deep, easy chuckle that surprised us both. "Trust me, Helen, I think the look on your face when I said my name was Commander Miller will haunt me forever," I countered good-naturedly. It was quite a sight. She laughed too, a surprisingly pleasant sound. The ice had completely melted, replaced by a warm, shared moment of self-deprecating humor. "Well," she said, leaning slightly closer, "I suppose I owe you a new set of tires, then. For the unnecessary police attention." "No need for new tires," I assured her. "Just promise me one thing." "What's that?" "If I ever park my truck across my own driveway again, you'll just leave a sticky note on my windshield asking nicely to move it." "Deal," she agreed, extending her hand. We shook on it, a firm, sincere handshake that sealed our neighborly truce and friendship. As she walked away with Ethan, I realized that the ridiculous, infuriating incident that began with her calling the police had unexpectedly become the most effective community-building event our street had seen in years. The Karen was gone, replaced by Helen, a human being capable of recognizing a mistake and finding common ground. And I, the base commander, had found a new level of quiet respect and an unlikely ally right next door. The ripples of the initial incident didn't just stay confined to our quiet residential street, they eventually reached the base. A few weeks after the community picnic, I received a call from the Public Affairs Office, PAO. Apparently, Officer Rodriguez, in his post-incident report, had noted the Commander Miller detail, and the information had been gently forwarded up the chain of command, not as a complaint, but as a humorous anecdote of civil-military relations at the neighborhood level. The POW chief, Lieutenant Colonel Evans, found it highly entertaining but saw a potential public relations angle. "Sir, you've unintentionally become a local legend," Evans reported, barely containing his laughter. The city police chief actually called me to apologize for the overzealous neighbor incident, saying they were thrilled to have the commander in their neighborhood and ensuring me that Mrs. Henderson's complaint was flagged as frivolous and unwarranted. But here's the kicker: we realized we don't have a clear, easily accessible policy summary for local civilian neighbors about reporting issues, especially regarding base personnel who live off base. Evans proposed a joint initiative with the City Council and the Neighborhood Association, including Helen, to draft a simple, friendly flyer. The goal was twofold: first, to clarify property boundaries, noise ordinances, and the proper non-emergency channels for complaints, and second, to subtly highlight the importance of communication over confrontation, emphasizing that many base personnel are public servants first and foremost, deserving of the same respect as any neighbor. This flyer would be distributed throughout the immediate community, serving as a gentle educational tool. I approved the initiative immediately. It was a perfect, productive outcome from an absurd situation. The flyer, titled "Good Neighbors, Strong Community," explicitly included a section advising residents that if they have a non-emergency issue with a base resident, a friendly conversation is the preferred first step, and if necessary, they could contact the neighborhood association before tying up emergency lines. Helen, surprisingly, was asked to be on the small committee that reviewed the draft language, precisely because she was the case study that necessitated the policy. She accepted the role with sincere commitment, seeing it as an opportunity to genuinely contribute to the community she had once sought to control. It was a testament to the power of public humility and the potential for a negative experience to drive positive, systemic change. The base commander's driveway had become the unlikely birthplace of a new community policy. The Good Neighbors, Strong Community flyer was finalized and distributed a few weeks before the winter holidays. It was professional, polite, and effective, bringing a noticeable drop in the kind of low-level, petty calls that had plagued the local police precinct. Helen, now serving her new role as a reformed community participant, even stopped by my office at the base, after checking in through proper security channels, of course, to personally drop off the first proof copy for my final sign-off. The entire experience had elevated her standing in the community from neighborhood tyrant to local policy advocate, a true redemption arc. As Christmas approached, the base held its annual holiday open house. It was a festive event, and many neighbors, including members of the newly formed Community Liaison Committee, were invited. Helen and her husband attended, and I made a point of greeting them warmly. As we spoke, her husband, Robert, a quiet man who had clearly endured his wife's previous antics with stoic patience, pulled me aside with a mischievous twinkle in his eye. "Commander Miller," he said, lowering his voice, "Helen sent out the most incredible Christmas card this year. You've got to see it." A few days later, a card arrived at my house. Inside was a beautiful, non-denominational holiday greeting. Below the printed message, Helen had carefully written a personal, final note, wishing you and your family a safe and happy holiday season. "And don't worry if I see that truck parked sideways again, I promise to bring the sticky notes, not the handcuffs. Happy New Year, Helen." Attached to the note was a small, glossy photo. It wasn't a family picture, but a perfectly framed, professional shot of a tiny, high-quality, magnetic sticker featuring an image of her poodle, now wearing a Santa hat, standing next to a miniature illustration of a tow truck. The sticker read, "Call Helen first. It's easier." I burst out laughing. It was the absolute perfect encapsulation of the entire saga, self-aware, humorous, and a complete acknowledgement of her past overreaction. It was the final, satisfying curtain call on the incident. The base commander had not only secured neighborhood peace but had fostered a genuine friendship with the woman who had tried to have him arrested. My quiet weekend had certainly been eventful, but the lasting goodwill and the final, witty Christmas card were worth every second of the initial frustration.